A crow sat on Boy's coffin during the funeral. 10 minutes later, something shocking happened. The gentle crunch of breadcrumbs beneath Ethan Carter's sneakers had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Every day after school, rain or shine, the 12-year-old would make his way to Cedar Grove Park, his pockets stuffed with leftover sandwich crusts and dried corn kernels. Some kids his age rushed home to video games or soccer practice, but Ethan had a different calling, one that took wing on glossy black feathers and spoke in throaty caws. "Hey there, friends!" Ethan's voice rang out across the autumn-kissed park as he approached his usual spot beneath the old oak tree. Within moments, dark shapes descended from the surrounding branches, crows, their feathers gleaming like polished obsidian in the afternoon sun. They moved with a calculated grace, hopping closer as Ethan reached into his pocket. Among the gathering of birds, one crow stood out. Larger than the others, with a distinctive white feather tucked among the black ones near its left wing, it approached Ethan with a familiarity that spoke of countless shared afternoons. Ethan had nicknamed him Shadow, though he knew crows probably had their own names for each other in whatever language they spoke among themselves. "Here you go, Shadow," Ethan murmured, tossing a special piece of whole grain bread toward his feathered friend. The bird caught it midair with impressive precision, earning a delighted grin from the boy. Unlike the other crows that kept a cautious distance, Shadow would often perch on the back of Ethan's usual bench, close enough that the boy could see the intelligent gleam in his dark eyes. Lisa Carter watched her son from the kitchen window on the days when his crow-feeding ritual brought him close to home. She'd initially worried about him spending so much time with wild birds, but there was something special about watching Ethan with his unusual friends. He seemed to understand them in a way that went beyond simple feeding. Sometimes, she'd catch him talking to them as if they were having a real conversation, especially to Shadow, who had taken to following Ethan part of the way home on occasion. "Mom, did you know crows remember faces?" Ethan had told her one evening over dinner, his eyes bright with excitement. "They never forget someone who's kind to them. And they tell other crows about it too. Shadow probably has a whole family somewhere, and they all know about me." Lisa had smiled at his enthusiasm, but there was truth in what he said. She'd read articles about crow intelligence, about their problem-solving abilities and complex social structures. Sometimes, on her way to work, she'd spot Shadow perched on a telephone wire, as if keeping watch over their neighborhood. It had become a comfort, somehow, knowing that her son had such loyal friends, even if they wore feathers instead of school uniforms. But comfort turned to catastrophe on a crisp October afternoon when 2 police officers appeared at her door. Their faces wore the grave expression that every parent dreads, and their words tore through Lisa's world like a hurricane. Ethan had been found in the river near the old mill, drowned. They called it an accident, a tragic slip, a current too strong for a 12-year-old boy. But even as she collapsed into her kitchen chair, even as neighbors began arriving with casseroles and sympathetic touches, something felt wrong. The days that followed passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and sleepless nights. Lisa moved through them like a ghost, her mind repeatedly returning to her last morning with Ethan. He had been excited about something, though now she couldn't remember what. Had he mentioned meeting someone? Going somewhere specific? The details slipped through her fingers like water, the same water that had taken her son. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cool, fitting weather for the darkest day of Lisa's life. Cedar Grove Cemetery lay just beyond the park where Ethan had spent so many happy hours with his crows. As mourners gathered around the small white coffin, Lisa stood nearest to it, her hand resting on its smooth surface. Friends and family murmured quiet condolences, their words washing over her without leaving an impression. Then, cutting through the somber atmosphere, came the distinctive sound of beating wings. Shadow, Ethan's faithful friend, descended from the overcast sky with unusual grace. The crow landed directly on Ethan's coffin, its claws making a soft click against the polished surface. The bird's appearance caused a ripple of whispers among the mourners, but Lisa felt a strange flutter in her chest, not of fear or surprise, but of recognition. Shadow settled himself at the head of the coffin, as still as a statue, his dark eyes scanning the gathered crowd with an intensity that seemed almost human. In that moment, Lisa remembered Ethan's words about crows never forgetting a face, and a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something in the way Shadow perched there, silent and watchful, suggested that this was more than just a bird saying goodbye to a friend who had shown him kindness. The crow's presence transformed the funeral into something else entirely, no longer just a ceremony of mourning, but a prelude to revelations that would shake their small community to its core. As Lisa watched Shadow's unwavering vigil, she couldn't shake the feeling that her son's death held secrets yet to be uncovered, and that this intelligent creature, this loyal friend of Ethan's, might hold the key to unraveling them all. What no one knew, as they stood in that cemetery watching the strange tableau of a crow standing guard over a boy's coffin, was that in just 10 minutes, everything they thought they knew about Ethan's death would be turned upside down. Shadow's appearance was not just a final farewell. It was the beginning of a truth that had been submerged beneath the river's surface, waiting to rise to the light of day. The whisper started as a gentle murmur, like leaves rustling in an autumn breeze. Mrs. Henderson, Ethan's elderly next-door neighbor, clutched her handkerchief tighter as she stared at Shadow's unwavering form atop the white coffin. "It's unnatural," she whispered to her daughter. "I've never seen a bird so still." Others among the mourners shared similar sentiments, their hushed conversations creating a soft undercurrent of unease that rippled through the gathering. Principal Matthews, standing near the back of the crowd, removed his glasses and wiped them nervously. "In all my years," he muttered, unable to finish the thought. The crow's presence had transformed what should have been a somber but ordinary funeral into something almost mythical, as if they'd stumbled into a scene from an ancient legend. Lisa Carter stood transfixed, her grief momentarily suspended by the strange spectacle before her. Shadow's posture reminded her of the military honor guard she'd seen at other funerals, proud, dignified, and filled with purpose. In that moment, a memory surfaced with crystal clarity. Ethan sitting at their kitchen table, homework forgotten, his face animated as he shared his latest crow research. "Mom, it's incredible!" he'd exclaimed, nearly knocking over his glass of milk in his excitement. "Scientists did all these tests, and they proved that crows remember faces and never forget kindness. But you know what's even cooler? They remember the bad stuff too. If someone's mean to them, they'll remember that person's face for years." Lisa had smiled at his enthusiasm then, but now those words took on a different weight. Shadow's presence felt less like coincidence and more like vigil or judgment. The funeral director checked his watch nervously, unsure how to proceed with this unexpected addition to the ceremony. He'd begun to step forward, perhaps to shoo the bird away, when everything changed. Exactly 10 minutes after landing on the coffin, Shadow's head snapped up as if pulled by an invisible string. The sudden movement caused several mourners to gasp. The crow's previous stillness made this abrupt animation all the more startling. Its black eyes, previously scanning the crowd with an almost lazy attention, suddenly locked onto something, or someone, with laser-like focus. The harsh caw that split the air sounded nothing like the friendly greetings Ethan had received in the park. This was a sound of accusation, of unbridled fury. Shadow's wings spread wide, catching the gray light like sheets of polished onyx, and launched himself from the coffin with explosive force. Several people ducked instinctively, but Shadow had a specific target in mind. The crow swooped through the crowd with deadly precision, straight toward Kyle Dawson, who stood near the middle of the gathering. Kyle, the community pool's head swim coach, had been a familiar face at local events for years. He'd helped organize numerous fundraisers for the school's swim team and was known for giving free lessons to kids who couldn't afford them. Now, however, his usual confident demeanor shattered as Shadow dive-bombed his head, razor-sharp beak aimed at his face. Kyle's arms flew up in defensive reflex, but Shadow was relentless. The crow's attacks came in swift, calculated strikes, each one accompanied by harsh cries that seemed to carry accusations in a language only Kyle could understand. "Get away!" Kyle shouted, swatting frantically at the bird. His usual well-groomed appearance deteriorated rapidly as Shadow's attacks forced him to stumble backward, nearly tripping over the chairs set up for the service. "Someone do something!" but no one moved to help. There was something about the focused nature of Shadow's attack that kept the other mourners rooted in place. This wasn't the random aggression of a territorial bird. This was something else entirely. The crow moved with purpose, with intent, with what could only be described as righteous fury. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as the strange scene unfolded. Kyle's increasingly desperate attempts to fend off Shadow created a macabre dance, their movement stirring up fallen leaves and small eddies around their feet. The sound of flapping wings and Kyle's panicked gasps formed an eerie counterpoint to the whispered observations of the shocked onlookers. Then, cutting through the chaos like a knife, came a young voice from the crowd. Ethan was supposed to meet Coach Kyle. The words, spoken by Ryan Mitchell, Ethan's best friend since kindergarten, carried clearly in the tense atmosphere. The 12-year-old's face was pale, his hands twisted together nervously as all eyes turned to him. The day he died. Ethan told me he had to meet Coach Kyle after school. Lisa Carter's head snapped toward Kyle, her eyes widening. This was new information that hadn't been part of the police report, information that hadn't come up in any of the discussions about Ethan's final day. The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of murmurs through the gathered mourners. Kyle, still batting at the persistent crow, tried to laugh it off. "Kids get things mixed up," he said, his voice strained as he dodged another of Shadow's attacks. I hadn't seen Ethan in weeks before his accident. But there was something in his tone, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before, that caught everyone's attention. Shadow's attacks, if anything, intensified at Kyle's words. The crow's cause took on an almost scornful quality, as if calling out the lie in the man's statement. Kyle's attempts to maintain his composed facade crumbled further with each dive bomb, each near miss of Shadow's sharp beak. The funeral had transformed from a ceremony of mourning into something else entirely, a courthouse where evidence was being presented by the most unusual witness imaginable. As Lisa watched Kyle's increasingly agitated behavior, she felt the first stirrings of a terrible suspicion. The nagging sense of wrongness that had plagued her since learning of Ethan's death suddenly gained focus, like a camera lens shifting to clarity. Something wasn't adding up about her son's death, and somehow, impossibly, a crow seemed to be the key to unraveling the mystery. As Shadow continued his relentless attack on Kyle Dawson, Lisa realized that this was only the beginning. The truth, whatever it might be, was about to emerge, and it promised to be darker than anyone could have imagined. Time seemed to freeze in the cemetery as Ryan Mitchell's revelation hung in the air. The young boy's words about Ethan's planned meeting with Coach Kyle had punctured the solemn atmosphere of the funeral, replacing it with something far more ominous. Lisa Carter's mind raced through memories of Kyle Dawson's interactions with her son over the years. The swimming lessons, the casual chats after school events, the way he'd always seemed so genuinely interested in Ethan's progress. Kyle had been a fixture in their community for the past 5 years, his easy smile and apparent dedication to his students making him a favorite among parents. He'd organized swimming competitions that brought recognition to their small town, helped raise funds for pool renovations, and even started a scholarship program for underprivileged kids. His reputation was spotless, until now. "Ryan," Lisa said, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "What exactly did Ethan tell you about meeting Coach Kyle?" She turned toward her son's best friend, noting how the usually outgoing boy seemed to shrink under the sudden attention of the gathered mourners. Ryan swallowed hard, his freckled face pale beneath his shock of red hair. "It was during lunch period," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Ethan seemed kind of worried. He said Coach Kyle wanted to talk to him about something important, but he wouldn't tell me what it was." The boy's eyes darted nervously toward Kyle, who had managed to put some distance between himself and the still circling Shadow. "Ethan made me promise not to tell anyone about the meeting," he said. "He said it was complicated." The word complicated landed like a stone in Lisa's stomach. What could have been so complicated that her 12-year-old son felt he couldn't share it with her? She studied Kyle's face, noting the thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Look," Kyle said, attempting to regain his composure while keeping one eye on Shadow. "This is all just a misunderstanding. Kids that age, they get things mixed up. Maybe Ethan mentioned wanting to talk to me about swimming lessons for the spring season. That's probably what Ryan's remembering. He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. But Ryan wasn't finished. The dam of silence had broken, and words poured out of him with increasing urgency. No, that's not it. Ethan was acting weird for weeks before what happened. He stopped talking about swimming practice. He wouldn't even go near the pool anymore. I asked him why, but he just said sometimes people aren't what they seem. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Thompson, who ran the school cafeteria and had known both boys since kindergarten, stepped forward. Now that Ryan mentions it, I remember Ethan sitting alone during lunch those last few weeks. He used to love sitting with the swim team kids, but suddenly he was keeping to himself. Kyle's attempts to downplay the situation grew more desperate. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising an octave. We're at a funeral, for God's sake. Are we really going to let the behavior of a bird and the confused memories of a child turn this into some kind of witch hunt? But there was something in his defensive tone, a note of panic that hadn't been there before, that caught everyone's attention. Shadow, who had been circling overhead, let out another accusatory caw and dove toward Kyle again, causing him to stumble backward into a decorative funeral wreath. If there's nothing to hide, Kyle, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, then why are you so nervous? Why wasn't this meeting in the police report? She turned to Officer Martinez, who had been standing quietly near the back of the gathering. Did anyone interview Coach Kyle during the investigation? Officer Martinez flipped through his mental notes, his brow furrowing. Coach Dawson told us he hadn't seen Ethan for at least a week before the incident. Said he'd been out of town at a swimming competition. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at Kyle. That is what you said, isn't it, Coach? Kyle's face, already pale, turned almost gray. Aye, that is. There must have been some confusion about the dates. He wiped his palms on his suit pants, his eyes darting between the crowd, Shadow, and the cemetery entrance. Listen, this is all getting blown out of proportion. Ethan was a great kid, one of my best students. Why would I have anything to do with his death? The word death seemed to echo across the cemetery, replacing the softer, more palatable accident that everyone had been using. Shadow responded with another aggressive dive, this one coming so close that Kyle had to throw himself to the ground to avoid the crow's sharp beak. As Kyle scrambled to his feet, Lisa noticed something fall from his pocket, a small key ring with what looked like a filing cabinet key attached to it. The memory of Ethan's last few weeks suddenly shifted into sharper focus. His distraction, his reluctance to attend swim practice, the way he'd been spending more time in the park with his crows instead of at the pool. There's something else, Ryan said, his voice stronger now, driven by some need to speak for his friend who no longer could. The day before it happened, Ethan told me he'd found out something bad. Really bad. He said Coach Kyle wasn't as nice as everyone thought, that he was hiding something. But he wouldn't tell me what it was. The tension in the cemetery ratcheted up another notch. Shadow landed on a nearby headstone, his dark eyes fixed unblinkingly on Kyle. The bird's presence seemed to grow more meaningful with each passing moment, as if it wasn't just a crow but justice itself taking physical form. Lisa stepped closer to Kyle, her grief temporarily transformed into something harder, more focused. What was my son going to tell you that day, Kyle? What was so important that you needed to meet with him secretly? What could have been so complicated that a 12-year-old boy felt he had to handle it alone? The questions hung in the air like storm clouds, heavy with the promise of thunder. As the mourners watched, waiting for Kyle's response, no one noticed the elderly man in a janitor's uniform making his way slowly through the crowd, his weathered face tight with the burden of knowledge he'd carried for far too long. I saw them. The words, spoken in a gravelly voice worn thin by years of silence, cut through the tension like a knife. All eyes turned to the elderly man in the janitor's uniform who had made his way to the front of the crowd. Jim Edwards had been maintaining the grounds around the river and community pool for over 2 decades, his stooped figure as much a part of the landscape as the old oak trees. I saw them by the river that day, Jim continued, his gnarled hands gripping his worn cap. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, fixed on Kyle Dawson. I didn't say anything before because, well, who'd believe the word of an old janitor over a respected coach? He paused, his weathered face creasing with the weight of his confession. But I can't keep quiet anymore. Not with that boy lying there, and his mother never knowing the truth. Lisa Carter stepped forward, her heart thundering in her chest. Please, Mr. Edwards, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell us what you saw. The old janitor nodded slowly, as if finally shrugging off a heavy burden. I was cleaning up around the river bend that afternoon, near the old mill where the kids aren't supposed to go. I heard voices, angry voices. The boy, Ethan, he was confronting Coach Kyle about something. I couldn't hear everything, but Ethan kept saying something about papers and money. Kyle's face, already pale, turned ashen. Shadow, still perched nearby, let out a low, menacing caw that seemed to emphasize each of Jim's words. I should have stepped in right then, Jim continued, regret heavy in his voice. But I thought, well, Coach Kyle's always been good with the kids. I figured they were just having a disagreement about something routine. Then I heard Ethan say he was going to tell someone. That's when... His voice trailed off, the memory clearly painful. That's when what? Officer Martinez pressed, stepping forward with his notepad out. That's when Coach Kyle grabbed him. Jim's eyes closed briefly, as if trying to shut out the image. Not like he was trying to hurt him, more like he was trying to scare him into keeping quiet. But Ethan struggled, and there was a scuffle, and then... A collective gasp went through the crowd as Jim's implications sank in. Kyle, who had been backing away slowly, suddenly found his escape route blocked by several mourners who had moved to surround him. You're lying, Kyle said, but his voice cracked on the words. You're just a confused old man who probably dozed off on the job and dreamed this up. But another voice joined the chorus of revelations. I believe him, said Sarah Patterson, a 15-year-old member of the swim team. She stood up from her chair, twisting her hands nervously in her black dress. A few weeks ago, I overheard Ethan talking to himself in the locker room after everyone else had left. He was saying something about Coach Kyle not being as nice as everyone thought, about how he was doing something wrong with the team's money. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Lisa remembered how Ethan had been elected treasurer of the junior swim team's fundraising committee just 2 months before his death. He'd been so proud, telling her how Coach Kyle had specifically recommended him for the position because he was good with numbers. The fundraising accounts, Lisa breathed, sudden understanding dawning. Ethan had access to the records. Kyle's composure finally cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and his eyes darted frantically between the faces surrounding him. Shadows swooped down again, forcing Kyle to stumble backward, closer to Ethan's coffin. You don't understand, Kyle said, his voice taking on a pleading edge. The pool was going to close without those renovations. The board wouldn't approve the full budget. I just borrowed some money from other accounts. I was going to pay it back. But Ethan found out, Lisa said, her voice hollow with realization. My 12-year-old son discovered you were stealing, and instead of admitting what you'd done, you... She couldn't finish the sentence. The sound of police sirens in the distance added a new layer of tension to the scene. Officer Martinez had stepped away briefly to make a call, and now backup was arriving. Kyle's eyes grew wild as he realized the net was closing in. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Kyle said, his words tumbling out faster now. I just wanted to scare him a little, make him understand that sometimes adults have to do complicated things for the greater good. But he wouldn't listen. He kept saying he had to tell someone because it was wrong, and his mom had always taught him to stand up for what was right. Lisa felt her knees buckle at these words. Ethan's last moral stand, his determination to do the right thing, had cost him his life. Shadow, as if sensing her distress, flew down to perch on the coffin again, its dark eyes never leaving Kyle. I never meant to. Kyle's voice cracked. When he slipped, when he hit his head, I panicked. The current was so strong, and I just ran. I convinced myself it was an accident, that no one would ever know. But something, had known. Shadow's presence took on new meaning as the truth emerged. The crow had been there that day, watching from the trees as tragedy unfolded. Nature's witness to a crime that might have remained buried if not for the unwavering loyalty of a bird that never forgot a face, or an injustice. Police cars pulled up to the cemetery gates, their lights casting red and blue shadows across the gathered mourners. Kyle Dawson stood frozen, trapped between the approaching officers and the dark wings of justice that had pursued him to this moment of truth. The weight of Kyle's partial confession had barely settled over the cemetery when Officer Martinez stepped forward, his face grim with professional determination. "Mr. Dawson, I need you to tell us exactly what happened that day. No more half-truths." The gathered mourners formed a tight circle, their presence creating an impromptu courtroom among the gravestones. Shadow remained perched on Ethan's coffin, a dark sentinel overseeing this final accounting. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the bitter scent of long-buried secrets about to surface. Kyle's shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of his carefully constructed facade crumbling away. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I'd been taking money from the swim team fund for months. Small amounts at first, just enough to cover some personal debts. But it got easier each time. The school trusted me completely, never questioned my reports." Lisa felt each word like a physical blow. The man they'd all trusted, the coach who'd been photographed with the mayor holding oversized checks at fundraising events, had been stealing from children all along. "But Ethan," Kyle continued, his voice catching, "he was too smart for his own good. As junior treasurer, he started asking questions about discrepancies in the accounts. He noticed patterns I thought no one would catch, especially not a 12-year-old kid." Ryan, still standing near Lisa, nodded slowly. "That's why he was staying late after practice sometimes. He told me he was doing extra work for the treasury, but he seemed worried about it. The day it happened," Kyle said, each word seeming to age him further, "Ethan came to me with a folder full of printouts. He'd gone through every transaction for the past year, tracked every missing dollar. He said..." Kyle's voice broke. "He said he'd figured out I'd taken almost $50,000. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Principal Matthews stepped forward, his face ashen. "That was meant for the Children's Swimming Scholarship Fund. For families who couldn't afford lessons." Kyle's face twisted with something between shame and defiance. "I had gambling debts. People were threatening me. I thought I could win enough to put it all back before anyone noticed. But Ethan..." His eyes darted to the coffin. "Ethan figured it all out." Lisa's mind raced back to her son's last few weeks, his distraction, his quiet moments of worry she'd attributed to normal preteen concerns. All along, he'd been carrying the weight of this discovery, trying to figure out the right thing to do. "He confronted me by the river," Kyle continued, the words now pouring out in a torrent. "Said he had copies of everything, that he was going to turn them into the school board. I tried to reason with him, told him how it would ruin my life, how I'd lose everything. But he just looked at me with those eyes, those damn righteous eyes, and said sometimes doing the right thing hurts." Shadow let out another call, the sound carrying an almost human quality of accusation. Kyle flinched at the noise before continuing. "I grabbed him," Kyle said, his voice hollow. "Just to scare him, to make him understand. We were near the edge of the river bank. I thought if I could just make him see reason." His hands trembled as he mimicked the grabbing motion. But he pulled away. There was loose gravel near the edge. He slipped. Lisa's cry of anguish cut through the air like a knife. Several mourners moved to support her as her knees threatened to buckle. "The sound," Cal said, lost in the horrible memory. "The sound of his head hitting that rock. I'll never forget it. He was unconscious before he hit the water. The current was so strong that day. I watched him." Kyle's voice failed him momentarily. "I watched him disappear around the bend." Officer Martinez's voice was steel. And instead of calling for help, instead of trying to save him, you ran. I panicked. Kyle's composure finally shattered completely. I told myself he might have survived, might have washed up downstream. When they found him 2 days later, I convinced myself it was better if no one knew the truth. That it wouldn't bring him back anyway. But someone did know, Jim Edwards said quietly, pointing upward. That crow, Shadow, as Ethan called him, was there that day. I saw him in the trees near the river. He saw everything. The revelation sent a ripple through the gathering. Shadow's presence at the funeral, his focused attack on Kyle, took on an even deeper significance. The bird had been more than just Ethan's friend. He had been a witness to his final moments, carrying that knowledge until justice could be served. I need to see those financial records, Officer Martinez said, his notepad forgotten as he pulled out his handcuffs. They're still there, Kyle said, deflated. In my office at the pool. Bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The key fell out of my pocket earlier when... He gestured vaguely at Shadow. Lisa stumbled forward, her grief transforming into rage. You let us think it was an accident. You attended his wake. You stood there and hugged me, told me what a wonderful swimmer he was, how much you'd miss him. All while knowing you were the reason he was finished. I'm sorry, Kyle whispered, but the words sounded hollow in the face of such betrayal. I never meant for any of this to happen. Shadow spread his wings wide, casting a brief shadow over Ethan's coffin. The movement seemed to underscore the inadequacy of Kyle's apology, the impossibility of undoing what had been done. A young life had been lost not to a simple accident, but to the desperate actions of a man who had chosen his reputation over a child's life. As Officer Martinez began reading Kyle his rights, the truth of Ethan's last day was finally complete. He had died not through his own carelessness, but because he had been brave enough to stand up for what was right. In his final moments, he had demonstrated a moral courage that put his adult mentor to shame. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Kyle Dawson's wrists echoed across the cemetery like a final punctuation mark to this tragic story. Officer Martinez and his fellow officers began leading the former coach away, his head bowed in defeat. The gathered mourners watched in silence as the man they had once respected was escorted to a waiting police car. Lisa Carter stood rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to process everything that had transpired in the past hour. The truth about her son's death had emerged in the most unexpected way, through the unwavering determination of a crow who had refused to let justice go unserved. She watched as Shadow, still perched atop Ethan's coffin, tracked Kyle's departure with those intelligent dark eyes. Mrs. Carter, Officer Martinez said, pausing before following his colleagues. I know this doesn't bring Ethan back, but we'll make sure Kyle Dawson faces the full consequences of his actions. Both the financial crimes and... He hesitated, his professional demeanor softening. And what happened to your son? Lisa nodded, unable to form words past the lump in her throat. Ryan, who had stayed close to her throughout the revelations, suddenly spoke up. Ethan would be glad the truth came out, he said, his young voice carrying the wisdom of grief. He always said that secrets have a way of coming to light, like how the sun always breaks through the clouds eventually. The comment sparked a fresh wave of memories for Lisa, Ethan's unwavering sense of right and wrong, his determination to stand up for what he believed in, even when faced with adult authority. Her son had died showing more courage than most grown-ups ever managed to summon. Principal Matthews approached, his face drawn with emotion. We'll make sure Ethan's legacy lives on, he said quietly. The scholarship fund, the one Kyle stole from, we're going to rename it the Ethan Carter Memorial Swimming Scholarship. It will help children from underprivileged backgrounds learn to swim, just as Ethan would have wanted. Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly crying, stepped forward to squeeze Lisa's hand. Your boy was a hero, she said softly. He stood up for what was right, even when it was scary. That's something we should all remember him for. Shadow suddenly took flight from his perch on the coffin, but instead of leaving, he circled once and landed gently on a nearby headstone. The bird's presence had transformed from an oddity to something almost sacred, a reminder that justice can come from the most unexpected sources. I always thought Ethan was exaggerating about how smart crows are, Brian said, watching Shadow with wonder. But he was right. They remember everything, and they know the difference between right and wrong, just like he said. Jim Edwards, the elderly janitor who had helped break the case open with his testimony, nodded solemnly. Nature has its own way of keeping score, he said. That bird knew what happened to its friend, and it wasn't going to let the truth stay buried. As the police cars pulled away, their sirens silent out of respect for the cemetery's solemnity, the gathered mourners began to disperse. But this was no longer just a funeral for a tragic accident. It had become a testimony to one boy's courage and the unexpected allies who had ensured his story would be told. Lisa approached her son's coffin, placing her hand on its smooth white surface one last time. You did the right thing, sweetheart, she whispered. I am so proud of you. The weight of grief still pressed heavy on her heart, but it was different now, cleaner somehow, unburdened by the nagging questions that had plagued her since Ethan's death. Shadow, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere, flew down from the headstone to land once more on Ethan's coffin. The crow's presence felt like a blessing, a final tribute to the boy who had shown such kindness to these remarkable creatures. Thank you, Lisa said softly to the bird, feeling no embarrassment about addressing it directly. Thank you for not letting them get away with calling it an accident. Thank you for being there for him, both then and now. Shadow tilted his head, regarding her with one bright eye, before letting out a soft caw that seemed gentler than his earlier cries of accusation. Then, with a graceful movement, he spread his wings and took to the sky. The mourners watched as he circled the cemetery once, twice, 3 times, a farewell flight that felt like a ceremony in itself. As Shadow finally flew away, disappearing into the autumn sky, Lisa felt something settle in her heart. The truth about Ethan's death had been revealed, justice would be served, and her son's memory would live on not as a victim of a tragic accident, but as a young hero who had stood up for what was right. The funeral would resume shortly, but it would be different now. They weren't just saying goodbye to a boy who had died too young, they were honoring a child who had shown remarkable courage, whose story would inspire others to stand up for truth and justice, no matter the consequences. Goodbye, my brave boy, Lisa whispered as she watched Shadow vanish into the distance. The crow's mission was complete, justice had been served, and while nothing could bring Ethan back, his story would not be forgotten. In the years to come, people would talk about the boy who befriended the crows, who stood up for what was right, and whose feathered friend had ensured that truth and justice would prevail. The autumn wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying with it the last echoes of Shadow's farewell call. And though Lisa's heart still ached with loss, she found comfort in knowing that her son's final act had been one of courage, and that even in death, he had made a difference in the world. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful witnesses to truth are not human at all, but rather the silent observers of nature who watch, remember, and in their own mysterious ways, ensure that justice is served.